All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. It is midterms week. We are looking at some interesting stories from past midterms as we gear up for this year's midterm election. Maybe some stuff that will get you thinking or just some trips down memory lane. Today, we go to 2010, to the great state of Delaware, and to a phrase that will be forever lodged, in my head at least, I'm not a witch. An actual phrase uttered by an actual candidate for Senate in an actual ad that aired on actual TV. And it actually did not help at all. Christine O'Donnell, the not witch, would go on to lose to Chris Coons in that election in early November by 17 points or so. So let's talk about Christine O'Donnell, the 2010 election, the whole I'm not a witch thing, and also the Tea Party election, and lots more. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And you, right before we started recording, rightly pointed out something that I had not realized, but we are airing this right before Halloween, so I guess this is our Halloween special.
Spooky.
I have some thoughts about just kind of like, is accusing someone of being a witch that awful of a thing in the 21st century, but nevertheless.
Apparently, yes.
Apparently, yes.
She's like, I'm not a witch, I'm a Wiccan.
Right. But let's lay some context here and the path that got us to this ad that I think is the thing that really a lot of people remembered and got parodied in SNL and I would say backfired, which is the ad in which Christine O'Donnell does say, I'm not a witch. She also goes on to say, I'm you, which is an interesting phrasing. But a couple steps back, let's go to the summer because Christine O'Donnell probably first caught people's attention, Nikki, as someone who won a contentious GOP primary against a sort of GOP incumbent, establishment figure. And that, of course, is in the context of a 2010 election where we have all these Tea Party candidates who are doing these interesting things, particularly in the primary. So paint that picture.
So this is the first Tea Party election in 2010. The Tea Party had gotten underway in early 2009, just as soon as Barack Obama took office. There had been some special elections, which suggested that it was going to be a pretty strong year for Republicans. But it wasn't just an election that targeted Democrats. Within the Republican Party, there was a kind of brewing fracture where Tea Party, so further far right, often neophyte candidates, were challenging establishment Republicans. And this is what happens in several Senate races, but it happens here in Delaware, where Representative Mike Castle, who, as you mentioned, was a mainstay of the Republican Party in Delaware, thought to be a shoo-in for this nomination, ultimately loses to Christine O'Donnell, someone who had never held public office. She had run before and just gotten annihilated in 2008. And she defeats him and then goes up against Chris Coons for this Senate seat. And ultimately, as you mentioned, she loses by quite a bit. But I think that she was fascinating because she was one of those candidates who did successfully move the Republican Party to the right by unseating Mike Castle, but who also proved not quite ready for prime time.
Yeah. I mean, she had some pretty strict, I would say hardcore beliefs about her. You know, she was a Catholic, which is not unusual. She pushed for abstinence as a alternative to, in talking about sex education. She was a huge fan of Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. She actually served as a consultant on that film. But, you know, she had some sort of conservative sentiments about her. But I think what really sort of did her in was when she had this appearance on the Bill Maher show, and you know, it was trying to, I'm not quite sure, maybe y'all can tell me, I'm not quite sure if she was trying to make a joke or be light or funny by saying like, I dabbled in witchcraft, you know, like maybe she thought that a show like this, which was meant to have a political but also comedic edge, was something that she could have some levity to, and that people could poke fun, and that it would just be like this simplistic thing, and then it really took off.
Yeah, and so this was, you know, to lay out the timetable here, in September of 2010, so after Christine O'Donnell wins this surprising primary, Bill Maher released footage from 1999, you know, so a long time before, of O'Donnell saying these things. And O'Donnell had been a long-time guest on Politically Incorrect, which I think you're exactly right, Kelly. That's a huge part of this. It's like a show that's mixing comedy and entertainment and, you know, I think politics, libertarian politics or whatever. And so she does say this thing, and Maher brings it out. He's like, yeah, former guest or someone, you know, our audience knows has sort of said this interesting thing 10 years ago. And it's, I dabbled in witchcraft. I never joined the coven, but I dabbled in witchcraft, you know, and she's talking about like her high school days, you know, and, you know, she says like, one of my first dates was with a witch, and I went on a satanic altar, and I didn't know, but, you know, there was like some blood and stuff there. We went to a movie, and then we had a midnight picnic on a satanic altar. Like, I can't tell whether this is real or whether this is, like high school kid sort of like, I want to smoke clove cigarettes and listen to Joy Division and sort of be a little, a little witchy. But, you know, well, I don't know. I have thoughts on kind of like what it means that she sort of got her start in the sort of entertainment world, you know. But I'm curious, do we want to just talk about like what do we make of her quote unquote witchcraft first, and then we could talk about the sort of other deeper contours?
It's so in some ways we're like, what is this, Salem? You know, like in some ways I feel like people took this way too seriously, and the fact that she, you know, felt compelled to like cancel appearances afterwards as though she was trying to like get her story together. I'm not quite sure, but to me, I just felt like all of this could have been downplayed, but she kind of gives legitimacy to it by the fact that she comes out with this commercial. And then, you know, I had watched the commercial and I was joking with you guys that like she set herself up for failure because the background is like this black sort of smoky background, you know, and she's like, I'm not a witch, and I'm like, but like it looks very confusing. It actually, I felt like gave more credence to sort of that than it did anything than to diminish it or dismiss it.
I think to make sense of those comments about witchcraft, it's important to understand that she was coming out of a religious tradition and a kind of entertainment / religious identity in which she's getting some credibility from this brush with witchcraft, right? That she had been tempted by Satan, that she knew evil, and that she had come out on the other side, and that she was a witness to both evil and to redemption. This is something, you know, in all of those appearances on Bill Maher, she originally got her start on MTV, where she was talking about abstinence and how central her both religion and her religious choices were to her identity. That witchcraft story only serves, at least within her subculture, to heighten her credibility. And this is coming, you know, after 10 years of satanic panic and in a religious tradition that really does believe that witchcraft opens the door to Satanism and to evil. So I think that's important context for her, that it's not just a flippant comment.
I mean, I had friends who, you know, would not read Harry Potter because they were like, that's witchcraft. And they were serious about that, like hardcore serious. So, I mean, especially in certain, you know, pockets of the country, in certain conservative spaces, no, you weren't reading Harry Potter. No, you weren't sort of supposed to dabble in these things. It wasn't just trivial. It was a gateway to something really, you know, evil and satanic.
Yeah. Let's linger a little bit on that sort of Christian conservatism, especially in the context of this Tea Party moment, because we think of the Tea Party as largely animated by opposition to Obamacare, even if you take it at face value as a policy pushback, which I think we now in many ways recognize it was not. But, if we take it at face value as a policy pushback, it's Paul Ryan walking around with a bunch of documents under his arm that sort of push back on social security funding and Obamacare and so forth. So how then does a candidate like this, who really is Christian conservative, anti-abortion, all of these sort of quote unquote family values things, how is that someone who flows into this Tea Party moment?
I think it's because there was a kind of libertarian overlay over the Tea Party, right? This idea that it's taxed enough already, that it's about getting the government out of our lives. But the Tea Party was also a sentiment. It was anti-establishment. It was about overthrowing longtime Republicans as well as Democrats. And I think
And
that's
the swamp. Draining the swamp.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where somebody like Christine O'Donnell comes in, not necessarily because of her Christian conservatism, which by 2010 is sort of a given for most Republican candidates, but because she was, quote unquote, an outsider. And her religious beliefs in some ways played into that.
Yeah. So, if we're going to, and the parallels are not neat, but, if we are going to sort of see some of the strands that we feel like are still floating around in 2022 out of this, I think certainly one of that evangelical strand that's just simmering there, even as much as people talk about policy and so forth and economics, that's clearly one of them as well. I think the other one is, we touched on this, but, candidates who made their name and walked their path primarily in a media space. And, I was going to use the phrase not ready for prime time, but actually it's only ready for prime time, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly right.
She'd only been on TV in prime time. And then all of a sudden you're thrust into this is grown-up time, and you have to talk policy, and you have to kind of defend your past statements, and people are going to dredge it up. Obviously, the witch thing was the one that I would say sunk her, but she had some moments during debates where she kind of just didn't even understand the First Amendment. She couldn't talk policy. And, that's another thing. We talk about, and Republicans are at least establishment Republicans like Mitch McConnell are griping about this right now. Mitch McConnell was basically straight up said candidate quality is really important, basically saying we've nominated a bunch of people who are bad candidates. And, and if
don't know policy.
Yeah. And if Republicans are going to not take advantage of all those fundamental forces we've talked about the last few episodes of you tend to, in the midterms, swing back, it's because of candidate quality. It's because of, in the primary, sort of a bunch of people who weren't ready for primetime sneaking through. So that feels like a big part of the story here, too.
And that was a big takeaway from those Tea Party elections in 2010, 12, and 14, this idea that there were a number of winnable seats that were ultimately lost because the candidates weren't good.
But a takeaway is different from a lesson learned, right? Because here we are sitting with Dr. Oz, all these people who could blow what are very easily winnable seats.
And short-term thinking is very different from long-term thinking, because in the short term, they lost those seats. But in the long term, they moved the Republican Party much further to the right by clearing out those kind of establishment Republicans. So it in a way, the Tea Party won while losing.
And by the way, O'Donnell was up. I mean, it wasn't a ton of polling this, but O'Donnell was up by a couple points in July, and then come November loses by 17. And, O'Donnell afterwards said that she regretted putting out this ad and that it may have backfired by focusing attention on her decades-old statements about witchcraft. It's you think? I mean,
you don't say.
And I don't know, maybe just ignoring this entirely wouldn't have worked either. I actually think, Kelly, you kind of sort of mentioned it in passing, but I think canceling the Sunday show appearances in the 2 days between when this came out, that feels like that's the move.
It was a bad move. Yeah, it just was not. I mean, it seemed like it was tethered to this, I've got to, strategize, or I can't talk about this or whatever. And, now, to be fair, I don't know, should Bill Maher have even doled this out. You know, he apologizes for playing that clip or for sort of setting her up for failure. But I do think that there were real ways in which he could have just slapped all of this down, and starting her commercial with "I'm not a witch" was probably not the best idea. Even if you were trying to clear the air, that's not the way to go about it.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely iconic. Like you said, Jody, those words play in my head probably once a month, even though this was now 12 years ago.
Yeah. And I mean, I had to go find out whether that was, because SNL, of course, parodied this. And I was like, was this one of those situations where I remember the SNL parody and not the actual ad? And so I had to go check. But, the actual ad does start with, "I'm not a witch." So there you are. There's one other little angle here, which is, of course, when you talk about Delaware politics, you kind of have to mention Joe Biden. She had run against Biden in 2008 and lost by a lot. And in the wake of that, she, accused Biden of, spying on her or something. And then in the wake of this one, she kind of did the same thing. I don't know. What are we saying here? She didn't handle this that well.
No.
She was not a good loser.
No. I mean, it's just, and Biden, let's just be honest, in the state of Delaware is an institution, so there's that for one. But to sort of accuse him of that really feels, like she can't bow out gracefully. She
accused Biden of a plot to have her investigated for misuse of campaign funds. A judge did rule 6 years later that she had violated federal campaign funding law and used her money to pay her own rent and utility bills in 2010. So, just the dog that caught the fire truck, as they say. One larger question just about the sort of Tea Party legacy, because I think you can look at a story like this and see so many parallels to right now. But, I've also heard some people who covered the Tea Party and at the time were saying, hey, the Tea Party really is, not about policy. It's about all these other strains. But now they're looking back and saying, gosh, at least in the Tea Party moment, they were at least wrapping it in the language of responsible politics or whatever. And now we've just completely gone beyond that. So, I mean, do you feel is Christine O'Donnell, interestingly, a part of the Tea Party that still lingers? Because it's not policy, it's more personality and this sort of religiosity underlining all of it?
Certainly that anti-establishment sentiment outlasted the Paul Ryan policy agenda when it comes to the Republicans. I think the important thing in thinking about the Tea Party these days is to understand it as part of the transition from an older Republican Party to what we have now, that it contained all of the things that we know, like these media-driven candidates, racial animus, sort of 1776 LARPing, the overthrow of the Republican establishment. All of those ideas are packed into the Tea Party. But as you mentioned, it was marketed as a policy-driven movement. And those folks at the top who were pushing those policies, they're all gone, and the base remains. But
that dynamic you just laid out of the old guard just drifting away, I think you started to see that in the Tea Party moment, and it's only accelerated. Absolutely. That people are getting primaried, sure, and you primary enough people with quote unquote not ready candidates, but some of them are going to sneak through, right, and still get elected and have a Congress. But then you get all these people just deciding not to run again. And I remember around 2010, 2012, 2014 seeing this oh wow, just waves of Republicans are starting to just not run again, and all of a sudden there are these stats about the average tenure now in Congress just dropping precipitously. It's people have been here for 2 years, 4 years, and that has only accelerated. And so I think that's a big part of the strain that you can draw to today.
And people like Paul Ryan thought they could harness the energy of the Tea Party, and they were just wrong about that. They got swamped by it.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's leave it there. That is the first in our sort of look at a few interesting midterms. Next, actually, I've noticed the next few episodes we're going back in time. So that was 2010. Then we're going to go to mid-20th century, and then we're going to go to mid-19th century after that. But next episode is about the 1946 midterms. So we will do that next episode. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kelly Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
I'm not a witch. I'm nothing you've heard. I'm you. None of us are perfect, But none of us can be happy with what we see all around us. Politicians who think spending, trading favors, and backroom deals are the ways to stay in office. I'll go to Washington and do what you'd do. I'm Christine O'Donnell, and I approve this message. I'm you.
Radiotopia.